A man is mauled by a grizzly bear and left for dead, crawling 250 miles through the wilderness with nothing but revenge to keep him moving. A group of pioneers, trapped in relentless snow, face starvation so severe that only the unthinkable keeps them alive. An explorer walks into the desert, facing attacks, thirst, and hunger, driven by faith alone. By the end, you'll see how instinct, desperation, and faith rewrite the rules of survival. Each story pushes the limits of what a person can endure. But before anything else, it starts with a single moment, a sudden, violent encounter in the wild. Hugh Glass's ordeal began on a day that should have been like any other. He was scouting for game near the forks of the Grand River in what is now South Dakota, moving quietly through the brush when he came face to face with a mother grizzly bear and her cubs. The bear attacked instantly, defending her young with a violence that was absolute. Glass fought back, but there was no contest. The bear tore into him, claws raking his back and limbs, teeth ripping through flesh and muscle. When it was over, Glass was left barely alive, his body broken and bleeding into the earth. His back was slashed open, his left leg broken and twisted, and flesh hung in shreds from his bones. His throat was torn so badly that breath escaped through a wound in his neck. An eyewitness later described the scene. The flesh was stripped from the lower part of his body, his neck was so damaged that air leaked from the side, and his wounds seemed impossible to survive. When the rest of the trapping party found him, they saw a man who looked as if he'd already crossed into death. Glass was part of a fur trapping expedition led by General William Ashley, and now his injuries posed a problem for everyone. The expedition was deep in dangerous territory, surrounded by the threat of hostile tribes and the demands of the wilderness. Moving a dying man would slow everyone down. Staying put would risk the safety of the entire group. In the end, the decision was made to leave 2 men behind to watch over Glass until he died and could be buried. John Fitzgerald, a seasoned frontiersman, and Jim Bridger, a teenager just starting out, agreed to stay. But Glass didn't die. Days passed. He drifted in and out of consciousness, feverish and in agony, but refused to let go. Fitzgerald and Bridger waited, but as time dragged on and the threat of Arikara attack grew, they made a choice. Convinced Glass wouldn't survive, they took his rifle, knife, tomahawk, and fire-making kit. Everything that stood between a man and the wild. They left him with nothing but the bear hide they'd used as a shroud, then abandoned him. They later reported to General Ashley that Glass had died and been buried. Glass woke to find himself alone, defenseless, and deep in enemy territory. He should have died there, but something in him refused. He improvised a splint on his broken leg as best as he could, and wrapped himself in the bear hide. He could not walk, so he crawled. He dragged his shattered body across the prairie, inch by inch, toward the distant hope of Fort Kiowa, about 200 miles away. Every movement sent pain through his body. He could only take shallow breaths, air whistling through the wound in his neck. Infection threatened every open cut, but Glass let maggots eat away the dead flesh, knowing it was the only way to keep the wounds from rotting. He ate whatever he could find, roots, berries, insects. Survival was reduced to its most basic form. Keep moving, keep breathing, endure. The journey lasted nearly 6 weeks. The distance, about 200 miles, becomes almost impossible to imagine when you picture a man crawling, starving, and wounded across unbroken wilderness. He had no tools, no weapons. Once he found the remains of a buffalo calf killed by wolves and scraped what meat he could from the bones. He drank from streams, slept where he fell, and watched for the movement of hostile tribes. Sometimes he managed to stand and limp forward, but mostly he crawled, leaving a trail of blood and determination behind him. At a critical moment, 2 Mandan men found him. They carried him to a nearby trading post, giving him food and shelter. Without their help, Glass likely would have died before reaching safety. Their intervention marked a turning point, allowing him to regain enough strength to continue. After resting, he fashioned a crude raft and floated down the river whenever possible, using the current to carry him closer to Fort Kiowa. Glass's journey was filled with constant danger. He narrowly avoided encounters with the Arikara, whose attacks had already cost the lives of several trappers. He moved at night when he could, hiding by day. Sometimes he crossed open prairie, exposed to the elements and the threat of wild animals. He survived by adapting to every challenge, using whatever the land offered. When he finally reached Fort Kiowa, Glass was unrecognizable. He staggered in, gaunt and scarred, a living testament to what the human body can endure. But survival wasn't enough. The men who had abandoned him had taken his tools and his dignity. Glass's thoughts turned to revenge. He set out to find Fitzgerald and Bridger. He found Bridger at Fort Henry. Bridger was young, barely more than a boy, and Glass let him go. His real anger was for Fitzgerald, who had taken his rifle and left him to die. By the time Glass caught up to Fitzgerald at Fort Atkinson, Fitzgerald had joined the U.S. Army. Glass confronted him, demanding the return of his rifle. The Army protected Fitzgerald from further retribution. But Glass got his rifle back, a small measure of justice for everything he'd lost. Glass's story did not end there. He returned to the wilderness, resumed trapping, and his legend grew. The journey, about 200 miles on broken bones, with only instinct and willpower to keep him alive, became a symbol of what a person can survive when stripped of everything but the need to keep going. Yet sometimes, survival is not about one person's endurance. Sometimes it is a test faced by a group, where every decision carries consequences for everyone. In the bleak cold of the Sierra Nevada, a different kind of ordeal was about to unfold. One where the fight to stay alive forced people to confront the darkest corners of human desperation. In the spring of 1846, a group of families set out from Springfield, Illinois, their wagons loaded with supplies and hope. They called themselves the Donner Party. 87 people, men, women, and children, left behind everything familiar, aiming for California and the promise of a new life. They followed the Oregon Trail west, the same route thousands had traveled before them, but the choices they made would set them apart in the worst way. The leader, George Donner, was respected and trusted. The group included the Graves, Breen, Murphy, and Keseberg families, all looking for a fresh start. Their journey began with optimism, but as they approached the mountains, they faced a decision. Lansford Hastings, a promoter eager to sell his shortcut, claimed he knew a faster way to California. The Hastings Cutoff, he said, would save time and effort. But Hastings had never led wagons through it. The shortcut was longer, rougher, and untested. The Donner Party turned off the main trail. The shortcut led them into Utah's Wasatch Range, where the mountains slowed every wagon. Axles snapped, and the group lost precious weeks. Then came the Great Salt Lake Desert, flat and empty, with no water and no grass. Their oxen died or wandered off. The desert crossing drained their supplies and their strength. By the time they made it back to the main trail, they had lost a month and much of what they needed to survive. By early November, the party reached the edge of the Sierra Nevada. Winter came early that year. Heavy snow began to fall near Truckee Lake, now called Donner Lake, before they could cross the mountains. The snow trapped them in the valley. The wagons could go no further, and the group built makeshift cabins from logs and branches. The snowdrifts piled up, blocking any way out. They were cut off from the world. Food ran out quickly. They ate the last of their cattle and oxen. They boiled leather from their wagon covers, chewed bark, and dug for roots. Hunting parties returned empty-handed. The cold was constant. People grew weaker every day. Some died of starvation or illness. The survivors faced a choice that changed them forever. With no other food, they resorted to eating the bodies of those who died. It was a decision made in silence, out of necessity, and it left scars that would never heal. In December, 17 members of the group formed the Forlorn Hope. They made snowshoes from oxbows and hides, hoping to reach help on the other side of the mountains. They set out into the deep snow, carrying only a little food. Most were already weak. The journey was slow and brutal. Hunger and cold claimed many. Faced with no other choice, they too ate the bodies of those who died. Of the 17 who left, only 7 reached safety. Their story brought the first word of the trapped party to the outside world. Back at the lake, conditions worsened. The shelters offered little protection. The survivors waited, hoping for rescue. In mid-February 1847, the first relief party arrived. They found the cabins buried in snow, the people inside thin and hollow-eyed. The rescuers managed to take 23 survivors with them, but 21 remained at Truckee Lake and 12 more at Alder Creek. It would take several trips over weeks to bring out the rest. In the end, only 48 of the original 87 made it out alive. The numbers tell part of the story, but the real cost was harder to measure. The survivors carried trauma that lasted for years. Some faced public shaming, others struggled with nightmares and guilt. The story of the Donner Party became a warning about the risks of hope, the danger of shortcuts, and the thin line between civilization and survival. What kept them alive was not just the drive to reach California. Sometimes it was faith. Sometimes it was the need to stay alive for someone else. Sometimes it was only the refusal to give up, even when everything seemed lost. Their ordeal showed how quickly the rules can change when survival is all that matters. There are moments when a group's fate is tied together, and there are times when it all comes down to one person, alone against the odds. For Jedediah Smith, the fight for survival would play out in a place with no snow, no shelter, just heat, thirst, and the endless stretch of desert. Jedediah Smith's journey across the Mojave Desert in 1826 began without fanfare. He was not the sort of man who chased glory. He was quiet, steady, and guided by a sense of purpose that went beyond profit or adventure. At just 27 years old, Smith had already seen more of the American frontier than most men would in a lifetime. He wanted to find a route to California that no American had ever taken, a path west across the desert, using only what he could remember, observe, and learn from those who'd walked it before. Smith's belief in God was at the center of everything he did. He read scripture daily and prayed openly, not just for himself, but for the men who followed him. When he lost a companion, John Gardner, to illness, Smith wrote, "I am persuaded Gardner died in peace." For Smith, faith was more than comfort. It was a way to make sense of suffering and risk. It gave him something to hold on to when the landscape turned hostile, or when the way forward disappeared under the desert sun. The Mojave was an expanse of sand, rock, and heat. There were no reliable maps, only rumors and the knowledge passed between native peoples. Smith didn't travel alone. He led a small party, 16 men, a few horses, and some mules, determined to cross from the Colorado River to the Pacific. They followed the Mojave Trail, relying on guidance from native Mojave people who knew where scarce water could be found. This trail was not just a line on a map, it was a lifeline, marked by springs and river crossings that could mean the difference between survival and death. Smith had learned to respect the land and its people. He tried to keep peaceful relations with every tribe he met, offering gifts and trading for information. Most encounters went well, and the Mojave helped point the way. But not every meeting ended in trust. Tensions sometimes flared, and the threat of violence never fully disappeared. Smith's men understood that a wrong move, a misunderstanding, could end everything. Water was always the central problem. The desert offered little. The group rationed what they carried, filling canteens at every spring, but the heat drained them faster than they could refill. They chewed on cactus pulp and dug for roots, hoping for moisture. When a spring was dry, they pressed on, sometimes for days, lips cracked and skin blistered, following Smith's lead. He kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for the next sign of water, the next patch of shade. Every decision mattered. Smith was no stranger to pain. 3 years earlier, in 1823, he'd survived a grizzly bear attack near the Cheyenne River in present-day South Dakota. The bear broke his ribs, tore open his scalp, and left him bleeding and barely conscious. His men stitched his scalp back on as best they could, using needle and thread, with no medicine to dull the pain. Smith refused to let the injury stop him. He rested for 2 weeks, then continued leading his party. That same resolve carried him through the Mojave. The desert crossing tested everyone. Provisions ran low. Horses stumbled and died. Some days, the only thing that kept the group moving was Smith's insistence that they would make it. He prayed with his men, read from the Bible, and talked about the future waiting for them in California. When doubt crept in, Smith's calm steadied the group. He did not promise safety, only that he would not turn back. The Mojave was not empty. The group met bands of Mojave people who sometimes offered food or advice. Smith tried to repay their kindness, trading what little he could spare. But as they pressed deeper into the desert, the land grew harsher and the risks multiplied. One day, several of Smith's men left the main group to look for food and never returned. Later, Smith learned they had likely been killed in an ambush. Every loss weighed on him, but he kept the party moving, refusing to let fear or grief take over. After weeks of hardship, Smith and the survivors reached the edge of California. It was not a triumph in the usual sense. They were exhausted, thin, and nearly out of supplies, but they had done what no American before them had managed: crossed the Mojave Desert by land, guided by faith, native knowledge, and determination. Smith entered California with his remaining men, thinking only of rest and water. Their arrival was not the end of trouble. Mexican authorities, wary of American explorers, detained Smith and his men twice. Both times, Smith negotiated their release, using what Spanish he knew and relying on the intervention of local diplomats. He understood that survival meant more than just enduring the desert. It meant adapting to every new challenge, whether it came from the land or from people in power. Smith's time in California was brief. He knew he could not stay long. The political climate was tense, and the threat of further arrest was always present. He gathered his group, prepared for the journey back, and crossed the Mojave once again. This second crossing proved just as dangerous. Supplies were scarce, and the desert claimed more lives. Smith survived, but the toll was clear. What set Smith apart was not just his ability to survive, but the way he did it. He relied on his faith, his respect for others, and his willingness to trust when trust was possible. He listened to native guides, prayed for guidance, and took responsibility for the men who followed him. His endurance was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, persistent, and rooted in something deeper than fear. Smith's crossing of the Mojave became a quiet milestone. Others would follow his path, using the trails and maps he helped establish. But for Smith, survival was never just about reaching the end. It was about the choices he made along the way, who he trusted, what he believed, and why he kept moving forward when the desert offered only hardship. Each of these stories, Glass, the Donner Party, Smith, reveals something different about what drives people to survive. Sometimes it's revenge, sometimes it's the hope of community, and sometimes it's faith. The reasons change, but the test is always the same. In the end, what matters is not the distance covered, but what you hold on to when everything else falls away.